March 18, 1945. Rhine Air Base, northwestern Germany. The morning fog clings to the shattered runway like a funeral shroud. Major Walter Nowotny stands beside his Messerschmitt Me 262, watching Allied bombers streak across the gray sky in formations so vast they blot out the sun. His hand rests on the jet's sleek fuselage, still warm from the previous sortie. The aircraft beneath his palm represents the pinnacle of German engineering. A machine that can fly faster than sound itself seems possible. A weapon that should have turned the tide of this war. But as he looks across the cratered airfield at the handful of operational jets remaining, as he thinks of the fuel trucks that never arrived this morning, as he remembers the 3 pilots lost yesterday not to enemy fire, but to engine failure, he understands a truth that cuts deeper than any bullet. This miracle machine, this jet that was supposed to save Germany, has arrived in a world where miracles no longer matter. The story of the Me 262 begins not in desperation, but in ambition. In the late 1930s, when Germany's conventional air force was already the most feared in Europe, a handful of engineers and visionaries looked beyond propellers and pistons towards something revolutionary. Jet propulsion was barely understood, a theoretical concept that most military minds dismissed as fantasy. But at Messerschmitt's design bureau in Augsburg, Willy Messerschmitt and his team saw the future. They envisioned an aircraft that would render every other fighter in the world obsolete overnight. The British were secretly pursuing similar ideas as were the Americans, but Germany would be first. This was the promise of the jet age. And in those optimistic years before the war turned against them, German engineers believed they could build anything. The first prototype flew in July 1942, powered by a single piston engine because the jet engines weren't ready. When the Jumo 004 turbojets were finally mounted months later, test pilots reported experiences that defied everything they knew about aviation. The acceleration was brutal, pinning them back in their seats like a physical force. The Me 262 could reach the speeds exceeding 550 miles per hour, nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the best Allied fighters. In level flight, nothing could catch it. Nothing could run from it. The swept-wing design gave it a predatory grace that made conventional aircraft look like museum pieces. Messerschmitt had created something genuinely new, genuinely revolutionary, and for a brief moment, the Luftwaffe High Command allowed themselves to believe this single aircraft could compensate for all of Germany's mounting strategic failures. Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's most decorated aces, flew the Me 262 in May 1943 and immediately recognized its potential. Galland was not a man given to hyperbole. He had flown combat missions since the Spanish Civil War, had downed over 100 Allied aircraft, and understood aerial warfare with a clarity few possessed. When he landed after his first jet flight, he told his superiors that one Me 262 was worth 5 conventional fighters. He wrote urgent reports to Goering and Hitler, demanding immediate mass production. The jet, he insisted, could restore German air superiority over the Reich itself, could protect the cities from Allied bombing, could give Germany breathing room to negotiate an acceptable peace. He believed this with absolute conviction, and his enthusiasm infected other senior pilots who saw the Me 262 as salvation itself. But enthusiasm collides with reality, and in wartime Germany, reality was growing darker by the month. The Me 262's revolutionary design required revolutionary solutions to problems that had never existed before. The Jumo 004 engines operated at temperatures and speeds that pushed material science beyond its limits. The turbine blades spun at extraordinary velocities, subjected to stresses that would shatter conventional alloys. German engineers had developed specialized heat-resistant metals using chromium and nickel, but by 1943, Germany's access to these strategic materials was severely restricted. The Allied blockade, the loss of territories rich in resources, and the diversion of materials to other weapons programs meant that the exotic alloys required for reliable jet engines simply weren't available in sufficient quantities. The solution was compromise, and compromise meant failure. Engineers substituted mild steel coated with aluminum for the turbine blades, knowing full well this was inadequate. They reduced the operating temperatures and power output to extend engine life, which negated some of the aircraft's performance advantages. Even with these modifications, a Jumo 004 engine rarely lasted more than 10 to 12 hours of flight time before catastrophic failure. Some engines failed after just 2 hours. For comparison, a conventional piston engine of the era could operate for hundreds of hours between major overhauls. This meant that every Me-262 sortie was a gamble. Pilots taxied out knowing their engines might explode during takeoff, might flame out at altitude, might seize during combat when a single moment of lost thrust meant death. The maintenance burden was crushing. Each engine required careful inspection after every flight, and damaged turbine blades had to be replaced by hand, a process requiring specialized tools and expertise that most ground crews lacked. Spare parts were manufactured at a handful of factories that were themselves under constant Allied bombardment. A jet engine destroyed in combat couldn't simply be replaced. It might take weeks to procure a new one, if a replacement existed at all. Mechanics worked 20-hour shifts trying to keep aircraft operational, cannibalizing broken jets to keep a handful flying. They performed miracles of improvisation, but improvisation cannot compensate for fundamental design flaws and resource shortages. By early 1945, roughly two-thirds of all Me-262s built were grounded at any given time, waiting for parts that would never arrive. Then there was fuel, or rather, the absence of it. The Me-262 consumed a special kerosene-based jet fuel designated J2, which was chemically distinct from the aviation gasoline used by conventional aircraft. Germany's refineries, already struggling to meet the Wehrmacht's needs, had to be retooled to produce this new fuel, a process that required time, resources, and political will that were in desperately short supply. By mid-1944, Allied bombing campaigns specifically targeted Germany's synthetic fuel plants, the same facilities that produced J2. The raids were devastatingly effective. Monthly fuel production dropped by more than half. By the winter of 1945, it had collapsed entirely. Me-262 squadrons received fuel allocations measured in hours of flight time, sometimes just enough for a single sortie per week. Pilots sat in ready rooms watching the sky darken with enemy bombers. They had no fuel to intercept. The psychological toll was immense. They possessed the world's most advanced fighter aircraft and were unable to use it, forced into impotence by logistics rather than enemy action. Political interference compounded these technical and logistical nightmares. Adolf Hitler, increasingly detached from military reality, became fixated on the Me-262 in early 1944. But Hitler saw it not as the interceptor Galland and other pilots desperately needed, but as a fast bomber. He believed Germany's salvation lay not in defense, but in striking back, in punishing Allied troops advancing across France, in terrorizing London with high-speed bombing raids. During a meeting at the Berghof, Hitler demanded the Me-262 be modified to carry bombs. When Göring hesitantly mentioned that the aircraft was designed as a fighter, Hitler erupted in rage. He wanted revenge, wanted to see German aircraft hitting back rather than merely defending. His order was absolute, and within the Nazi command structure, Hitler's whims were law. The directive caused chaos at Messerschmitt's factories. Engineers scrambled to design bomb racks and release mechanisms for an airframe never intended to carry external stores. The modifications affected the aircraft's aerodynamics, reduced its already limited range, and complicated an already difficult production process. Months were lost to this redesign, months during which the Luftwaffe desperately needed pure fighters. When the Me-262A-2A Sturmbogel bomber variant finally entered service, it proved largely ineffective. Carrying 500 kilograms of bombs reduced its speed and maneuverability, making it vulnerable to Allied fighters. The bomb load itself was too small to inflict strategic damage, and pilots trained for air combat struggled with the intricacies of bombing runs. The entire episode was a study in how ideology and personal obsession can derail sound military strategy. By the time Hitler grudgingly permitted production of the fighter variant to resume in earnest, it was November 1944. The war had moved into its terminal phase. Allied armies were closing on Germany from east and west. The Luftwaffe had lost not just aircraft but experienced pilots, men whose training and skill could never be replaced. The elaborate infrastructure of air bases, supply chains, and command networks was collapsing under relentless pressure. Into this chaos came the Me-262, a sophisticated weapon that required sophisticated support systems that no longer existed. Approximately 1,400 Me-262s were produced between 1944 and the war's end, a number that sounds impressive until you consider that fewer than 200 ever engaged in combat operations. The rest sat on factory floors, in partially completed assembly lines, or on airfields without fuel, ammunition, or qualified pilots. Those that did fly faced an enemy that had learned to counter them with brutal effectiveness. Allied intelligence quickly recognized the jet's vulnerabilities. The Me-262 was fastest at altitude in level flight, but it was slow to accelerate, and its engines took considerable time to spool up to full power. This made takeoff and landing the aircraft's most dangerous moments. American and British pilots developed specific tactics to exploit these weaknesses. Rather than attempting the futile task of catching a Me-262 in level flight, they loitered near known jet bases, waiting for the German aircraft to land when they were most vulnerable. P-51 Mustangs and Hawker Tempests would dive on, returning Me-262s during their landing approach, when the jets had to reduce speed and couldn't maneuver aggressively without risking a crash. Dozens of Me-262s were destroyed this way, shot down within sight of their own runways. The tactic was so effective that Me-262 bases had to be ringed with conventional fighters flying constant patrols, further straining Germany's limited resources. Even then, losses mounted. Pilots who survived harrowing combat missions found themselves at their most vulnerable when they thought they were safe. Those who flew the Me-262 in combat described an experience that was simultaneously exhilarating and frustrating. Unteroffizier Karl-Heinz Becker, who flew with Jagdverband 44, recalled the moment of takeoff as unlike anything else in aviation. The acceleration as the UMO engines reached full thrust felt barely controlled, the aircraft leaping forward with an eagerness that bordered on violence. Once airborne, the Me-262 climbed at angles that would stall a conventional fighter. At altitude, it existed in a realm where Allied aircraft simply couldn't follow. Becker described engaging a formation of B-17 bombers, flashing past them so quickly the American gunners couldn't track him. He fired his 30mm cannons, devastating weapons that could tear a bomber apart with a handful of hits, and watched two fortresses fall away, trailing smoke before the rest of the formation even registered his presence. For those few seconds, he felt invincible. But invincibility is an illusion, and Becker's illusion shattered on his fourth mission. He engaged a group of P-51s escorting bombers over Bavaria. The Mustangs couldn't catch him in level flight, so they didn't try. They positioned themselves above his flight path and dove when he committed to an attack run. Becker's wingman disappeared in a ball of fire when his engine exploded from battle damage. Becker himself barely escaped, his jet's superior speed his only salvation. He landed with one engine sputtering, hydraulic fluid streaming from bullet holes, and the certainty that luck, not skill, had saved him. The Me-262 gave him advantages, but those advantages weren't enough. Not against enemies who outnumbered him 10-1, who could afford losses he couldn't, who controlled the sky through sheer overwhelming force. Adolf Galland, still believing the jet could make a difference, formed Jagdverband 44 in February 1945, an elite unit composed entirely of veteran aces flying Me-262s. It was a last-ditch effort to demonstrate the aircraft's potential, to show what could be accomplished if Germany's best pilots flew its best aircraft. The unit included some of the most decorated names in the Luftwaffe, men with hundreds of kills between them, aces who understood air combat at an instinctive level. They flew from Munich-Riem, launching desperate interception missions against the armadas of Allied bombers, reducing German cities to rubble. Jagdverband 44 achieved remarkable kill ratios. In roughly 6 weeks of operations, the unit claimed over 50 Allied aircraft destroyed for the loss of only a handful of jets in direct combat. These numbers seem to vindicate everything Galland had argued, but numbers lie when they lack context. 50 bombers destroyed represented less than 1% of the Allied bombing sorties flown during that period. Even this elite unit, flying the best available aircraft, couldn't meaningfully reduce the devastation raining down on Germany. The strategic calculus was merciless. Germany needed to shoot down hundreds of bombers per month to slow the Allied air campaign. The Luftwaffe, even with Me-262s, was destroying dozens. The gap was insurmountable. Moreover, Jagdverband 44's operational tempo was unsustainable. The unit suffered from the same fuel shortages, maintenance problems, and lack of spare parts afflicting every other Me-262 squadron. Pilots who wanted to fly multiple sorties per day found themselves grounded because their aircraft needed engine replacements, or there wasn't sufficient J-2 fuel available. Galland himself was shot down and wounded in April 1945, not by an Allied fighter, but by ground fire while attacking a bomber formation. The symbolism was hard to miss. Even the Luftwaffe's most capable pilot, flying the world's most advanced fighter, could be brought down by a bomber's defensive guns. Skill and technology had their limits. As March turned to April and April approached May, the pilots of the remaining Me-262 units came to understand what their leaders had refused to admit. The jet had arrived too late. Had it been deployed in 1942, when Germany still controlled most of Europe and had functioning supply lines, adequate fuel production, and a deep bench of experienced pilots, the Me-262 might have changed the war's trajectory. But it appeared in 1944, when Germany was already losing, when every system necessary to support advanced military technology was breaking down, when there was no time to solve the aircraft's teething problems, or train pilots properly, or build the infrastructure required for sustained operations. The pilots understood something else too. Even a perfect Me-262, one with reliable engines and unlimited fuel, couldn't overcome fundamental strategic reality. Germany was fighting the combined industrial might of the United States, the British Empire, and the Soviet Union. The Allies were producing tens of thousands of aircraft annually. Germany was producing hundreds of jets. The mathematical impossibility of the situation was obvious to anyone willing to see it. You cannot achieve air superiority when the enemy can replace 10 aircraft for every one you destroy, when their pilots are better trained because they have fuel for extensive flight training, when their maintenance crews have unlimited spare parts and yours are scavenging wrecks. There were moments of bitter clarity. Oberleutnant Franz Schall, one of the Luftwaffe's leading jet aces, sat in his cockpit on the morning of April 10, 1945, waiting for an engine replacement that would never arrive. He had 14 confirmed kills in the Me-262, had experienced the aircraft at its best, and now watched American fighters strafe the airfield unopposed because the anti-aircraft guns had run out of ammunition. He understood then that the war was over, that it had been over for months, that the Me-262 represented not Germany's salvation, but its final delusion. The jet was a technical marvel, but wars are not won by technical marvels alone. They are won by logistics, resources, training, and most of all by time. Germany had run out of all four. By the first week of May 1945, organized Luftwaffe operations had effectively ceased. Me-262 squadrons disbanded or surrendered en masse. Some pilots flew their jets to Allied-controlled airfields and defected. Others destroyed their aircraft rather than let them fall into enemy hands. A few died in pointless final missions, attacking targets that no longer mattered in a war that was already decided. The jets themselves became prizes for the victorious Allies, who shipped them back to America, Britain, and the Soviet Union for study. Engineers and pilots who had spent years perfecting jet technology now found themselves answering questions from the very enemies they had fought, explaining design philosophies and operational lessons that would shape the next generation of military aviation. The Me-262's legacy is complex and contradictory. From a purely technical standpoint, it was a triumph. It proved that jet propulsion was not just feasible, but superior for high-performance combat aircraft. It demonstrated design principles, swept wings, nose-mounted engines, tricycle landing gear that became standard for jet fighters worldwide. Every jet aircraft that followed owes something to the Me-262. American engineers borrowed its lessons for the F-86 Sabre. Soviet designers studied captured examples to accelerate their own jet programs. The British, who had their own jet, the Gloucester Meteor, nevertheless found valuable insights in Messerschmitt's approach. In the history of aviation, the Me-262 marks the moment when the future arrived, when the age of propellers definitively ended and the jet age began. But from a military and strategic perspective, the Me-262 was a failure. It consumed resources Germany couldn't afford to spare. It diverted engineering talent and industrial capacity from more practical weapons. It arrived too late to affect the war's outcome, and in too few numbers to achieve strategic impact even if it had arrived earlier. The thousands of man-hours spent developing and producing Me-262s might have been better spent building more conventional fighters, or tanks, or submarines, or any of the 100 other weapon systems Germany desperately needed. The jet represented the triumph of hope over reality, of belief in technological solutions to problems that were fundamentally political and economic. The pilots who flew it came to understand this painful truth in their bones. They had experienced what it meant to fly the future, to control a machine that made them feel like gods for brief moments between takeoff and landing. But they also experienced the grinding despair of watching that future prove insufficient. They learned that no single weapon, however advanced, can compensate for strategic disadvantage. They discovered that technological superiority means nothing when you lack the fuel to fly, the parts to maintain your aircraft, the pilots to replace your losses, the time to train new recruits properly, or the industrial base to produce weapons at the scale modern war demands. In the decades after the war, surviving Me-262 pilots gave interviews and wrote memoirs. Most expressed admiration for the aircraft itself while acknowledging its futility. Johannes Steinhoff, who flew with Jagdverband 44 and survived horrific burns when his Me-262 crashed during takeoff, later wrote that the jet gave pilots hope when hope was irrational. It allowed them to believe they were still fighting for something real rather than simply postponing the inevitable. But he also noted that this hope was a kind of cruelty because it prevented many from accepting that the war was lost and further resistance was merely prolonging suffering. Adolf Galland, in his post-war writings, reflected on the Me-262 with evident pain. He never retreated from his position that the jet could have been decisive if deployed earlier and in greater numbers. But he admitted that by the time the aircraft reached squadrons, Germany's situation was beyond salvation. He called the Me-262 the most formidable aircraft of World War II and a masterpiece that came too late. He bore responsibility for championing the program so forcefully, for raising expectations that couldn't be met, for believing that German engineering genius could overcome strategic disaster. The bitterness in his post-war statements suggests a man grappling with complicity in prolonging a war that should have ended sooner. The Me-262 stands now as a symbol of technological achievement divorced from strategic wisdom. It represents the dangerous seduction of wonder weapons, the belief that innovation alone can reverse military defeat. This belief has proven remarkably persistent. Throughout history, losing powers have placed faith in revolutionary weapons that would change everything. Super weapons, miracle technologies, game-changing innovations that would render the enemy's advantages obsolete. The Me-262 is perhaps the purest example of this pattern and its ultimate failure. It was genuinely revolutionary, genuinely superior to anything the Allies fielded until war's end, and genuinely irrelevant to the conflict's outcome. For the men who flew it, the Me-262 became a memory tinged with sorrow. They remembered the thrill of acceleration, the graceful efficiency of swept wings cutting through thin air, the predatory satisfaction of diving on bombers that couldn't escape. But they also remembered the friends lost to engine failures, the frustration of being grounded by fuel shortages, the humiliation of watching Allied fighters strafe parked jets with impunity, and the slow realization that they were participating in a technological marvel that had become a strategic irrelevance. They were the first jet pilots in history, pioneers of a new age in aviation, and they flew their missions in the twilight of a regime collapsing under the weight of its own crimes and miscalculations. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ended. Somewhere in Bavaria, a Me-262 sat abandoned on a forest runway, its engines cold, its fuel tanks empty, its pilot either dead or fled. Rain began to fall, collecting in the gun ports, running down the aluminum skin, washing away the last traces of oil and cordite. In fields across Germany, dozens of other jets sat similarly abandoned, monuments to what might have been if history had unfolded differently, if materials had been available, if Hitler hadn't interfered, if the war hadn't already been lost before they arrived. But history did unfold as it did, and the Me-262's pilots learned what every generation of warriors eventually learns: that courage and skill cannot overcome impossible odds, that advanced weapons cannot compensate for strategic bankruptcy, and that there are no miracle solutions to problems rooted in fundamental imbalances of power and resources. They flew the future and found it wanting, not because the future itself was flawed, but because they were trying to use tomorrow's weapons to salvage yesterday's catastrophic decisions. The Me-262 couldn't save Germany because Germany was beyond saving, and the pilots who realized this truth carried that knowledge like a wound for the rest of their lives. They had flown the most advanced aircraft in the world and discovered that advancement alone guarantees nothing. It was a lesson purchased at the cost of cities reduced to ash, millions dead, and a Reich that had promised 1,000 years lasting only 12. The jets remained silent witnesses to the limits of technology and the terrible consequences of believing that engineering brilliance can substitute for strategic wisdom and moral legitimacy.